Oyfen Sheydveg, At the Crossroads. The entire surrounding world is now standing at a crossroads, is living in great unrest, and is experiencing a profound socio-political and ideological crisis. One way or another, the world will extricate itself from this crisis. However, we Jews, if we do not find genuine support, a path, a new idea, and new internal strength in order to further maintain our existence as a nation, could be ground under the wheels of these fatal events. We are living in a time of the painful liquidation of the era of emancipation, with its humanitarian and democratic principles. We are being transformed into a nation of refugees, standing before closed gates, of homeless people without a prospect of a new home. Not only do they block all sources of life for us in the diaspora, but they also want to bar the source of the Jewish drive for development in Eretz Yisroel. Adversity makes a man wise. We must learn from our bitter trials, and above all, we must honestly and seriously begin to revise our old ideological baggage and leave intact whatever can keep up the depressed Jewish spirit and revive the frozen national energy. A revision not for the sake of mere critique, but rather in order to find new methods of struggle for Jewish survival. Searching for such paths, that is the purpose of our publication." Unquote. With this combination of bleakness and resolve, Elias, Tcherikower, and Yisroel Efroikin set the tone for one of the most sui generis journals ever to appear in Yiddish. By adopting the name Oyfen Sheydveg, At the Crossroads, the editors were consciously invoking the name of the cultural Zionist Achad Ha'am's collection of essays, Al Parashat Drachim. Whereas Achad Ha'am intended this term to connote the transformation of Jewish identity from a religious to a cultural, national one, Tcherikower and Efroikin meant it to reflect the external and internal crises of Jewish national politics and culture in 1939. Yet beyond this most obvious crossroads, the journal positioned itself at several other major cultural and political intersections. Culturally, nearly all the contributors positioned the journal at the crossroads between text and context. Given that nearly all of its contributors had made the personal transition from religious traditionalism to secular Jewish national identity, they attempted now to draw from the source that they once had disparaged. Most of the Oyfen Sheydveg articles, moreover, articulated a desire to flee from the context of a European civilization that had betrayed the Jews back into the comforting, self-sustaining world of the text. At the same time, having severed their personal connection to religious traditionalism decades before, most of these intellectuals found themselves too embedded in their secular contexts to actually return to traditional faith. These men thus found themselves in the unenviable position of, in Tcherikower's words, being part of a generation that had, quote, lost its old faith and despaired of the new, unquote. Like the religious forebears, however, these intellectuals feared assimilation as at least as great a threat to Jewish collective survival as anti-Semitism. In this paper, I first will address the political and cultural crises of European Jewry during the 1930s. Then I will address the response of some Yiddishist intellectuals to the consolidation of Nazi power and the abandonment of the Jews by the democracies in the late 1930s. Then I will return to an in-depth discussion of the journal Oyfen Sheydveg as an intellectual response to the crisis. Now for some historical background. On the eve of the Nazi rise to power, the Jewish birth rate had plummeted throughout Europe, and the intermarriage rate had risen. Respected sociologist Arthur Rupin attributed this demographic decline to assimilation and secularization. In 1939, the very year that the first volume of Oyfen Sheydveg appeared, Rupin declared the impending death of European Jewry, not through murder, but rather through what he termed, quote, race suicide, unquote. External persecution, however, overshadowed this internal demographic decline to create an unprecedented crisis, first for German and then for all of European Jewry. The universal emancipation of German Jewry that resulted from the unification of Germany in 1871 came to an end with the rise to power of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in 1933. It was the Nuremberg laws of 1935 that most unequivocally announced the Nazi intention to repeal the gains of Jewish emancipation through a ban on a Jewish presence in universities and the medical profession, expropriation of Jewish property, and a prohibition of intermarriage between Jews and Aryans. With the Anschluss, Hitler's invasion of Austria in March 1938, and its annexation of the Sudetenland in October of that year, hundreds of thousands of more Jews joined the ranks of German Jews. October 1938 also witnessed Nazi Germany's expulsion of approximately 15,000 Polish Jews, with 8,000 forced to live for months in military stables in a Polish border town. After a Jewish youth shot a German officer in Paris, the Nazi SA, the Sturmabteilung, the Storm Detachment, in supposed retaliation, orchestrated what came to be known as Kristallnacht, Night of the Broken Glass, which brought the looting and destruction of thousands of Jewish businesses, synagogues, and the deportation of tens of thousands to concentration camps on the night of November 9th, 10th. More than 90 Jews were murdered in these simultaneous attacks. Although not overtly fascist, interwar Poland proved a great disappointment to diaspora nationalist, Yiddishist intellectuals such as Tcherikower and Efroikin. In the first years of the 20th century, these men embraced these twin ideologies. Diaspora nationalism saw the Jews as belonging to a modern nation, but believed that they would achieve national renaissance, not through sovereignty in the land of Israel, but rather through national autonomy in the multi-ethnic states of Eastern Europe. Although they signed the Minorities Treaty following the end of World War I, Poland and most other successor states of East Central Europe had no intention of granting the Jews collective national rights. Rather, these new states discriminated against the Jews, even on an individual basis, in their efforts to favor their respective national majorities over minorities. This interwar phenomenon also greatly disappointed Yiddishists, who understood the Yiddish language as the most important marker of Jewish identity, in which the Jews would experience a cultural national renaissance. Interwar Poland witnessed instead a process of Jewish linguistic Polonization, despite rising anti-Semitic legislation and popular attacks. Perhaps even more disheartening to Jewish public opinion than Nazi persecution and East European marginalization were the Western democracies' reactions to these events. In May 1939, facing vociferous Arab resistance to its support of a Jewish national home in Palestine, the British government published the White Paper, which locked the doors of Palestine to the majority of European Jews by limiting immigration to 15,000 Jews per year until 1944, when it would cease altogether. In a nod to the humanitarian crisis, American President Franklin Roosevelt convened the Evian Conference on July 6, 1938, with the purported goal of alleviating the plight of refugees. In reality, all delegations to the conference, including the American, arrived with instructions from their governments not to accept more Jews into their countries than already allowed by the quotas. What many, including the Oyfen Sheydveg contributors, understood as the capitulation of the democracies came in October 1938 with the Munich Pact, in which England promised not to attack Germany for its invasion of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of no further expansion. By 1939, the maliciousness of Nazi Germany and its allies and the apathy of the democracies had transformed European Jewry into a camp people, quote unquote. Far more Jews were interred as refugees in camps in Poland, Holland, and France than in Nazi Germany itself. As Chaim Weizmann stated as early as 1936, the world, quote, was divided into places where they, the Jews, cannot live and places they cannot enter, unquote. Given this frightful plight, it is not surprising that some Jewish intellectuals despaired of humanism and of the larger world. The American Yiddish press began to debate the merits of a return to, quote, the ghetto, unquote. Given the constantly evolving meaning of the word ghetto since its origin in Venice in the 16th century, it is not surprising that many did not understand what these intellectuals meant. Did back to the ghetto mean a return to the alleged pre-modern Jewish separatism, to pre-modern Jewish observance and belief, or to the cultural confidence of more recent large Jewish urban centers? In April 1938, following the Anschluss, the New York-based Yiddish poet Yankov Glatstein gave vent to his rage at Western civilization's betrayal of the Jews in what would become his most famous and controversial poem, A Gute Nacht Welt, Good Night World. A leader of a young group of American Yiddish experimental writers, the Insichisten, the introspectivists, Glatstein previously had eschewed Jewish national themes in favor of poems of free verse, individual expression, and word experimentation. The appearance of Glatstein's poem on the front page of the introspectivist's journal, In Sich, thus served as a dramatic provocation to his readers. I quote the first lines of the poem in English translation. Good night, wide world, great stinking world. Not you, but I slam the gate. With my long black coat and fiery yellow patch, with a proud step and at my own command, I go back to the ghetto, unquote. Soon after the publication of Glatstein's poem, several other American Yiddish writers called for a return to the ghetto. Some of the most prominent Yiddish writers and public intellectuals, however, came out strongly against this call of retreat to the ghetto. Particularly noteworthy were the articles written by the Yiddish novelist Yosef Apotashu, the dramatist and poet Hay Leivik, and the literary critic Shmuel Niger. While sympathetic to Jewish disillusionment, Yiddish novelist Apotashu argued, quote, voluntarily going into the ghetto means burying ourselves alive, unquote. Leivik forcefully rejected the call of retreat into the ghetto if that meant Jewish isolation, and instead called for Jewish leadership in the redemption of the broken world. Niger rejected calls for isolation as defeatist and futile, instead arguing that the Jews' only option was to join the struggle for democracy. Now I turn to the themes of the journal Oyfen Sheydveg itself. Most of the articles in the journal answered the following questions. 1. Is the Nazi persecution of European Jewry a unique event in Jewish history? 2. Is the contemporary Jewish reaction to Nazism in keeping with the tradition of Jewish responses to catastrophe throughout history? If not, is the current response a healthy one? 3. What is the true historiosophical meaning of the Jews' current frightful plight? 4. As a prelude to a search for solutions, the authors address the following question: are the Jews a normal or an exceptional nation? And 5, what are the political and cultural solutions to their current predicament? Do these solutions entail Jewish political isolation from the world or integration into it? Tcherikower addressed the first two questions toward the beginning of his article, Die Tragedie von a schwachen Dor, the tragedy of a weak generation, which served as the journal's lead piece. Whereas previous generations had reacted to their suffering with spiritual growth, he argued, this generation had not. In his words, the tragedy of our generation does not consist in the amount of afflictions that have befallen our lot, but rather in that the generation has lost the old beliefs and has despaired of the new. Through and through individualistic, skeptical, and rationalistic, our generation is devoured by assimilation, right or left, and has lost its path strength. It stands now empty, expelled, without the innocence of a believer and without the primitive strength of a fighter, without any consolation in its afflictions. For this reason, the last 6 years of the swastika crusade did not cause us to have a spiritual crisis." Unquote. Tcherikower was not alone in contrasting the spiritually heroic reaction to persecution of past generations with the anemic one of those living in the present. According to the philologist and Yiddishist Zelig Hirsch-Kalmanovich, it was both the meaninglessness and inescapability of the persecutions for contemporary Jewry that separated them from their medieval parallels. In the past, Jews understood persecution as both an inherent attribute of the exilic experience and as divine punishment. In the present, in contrast, even committed Jews bristled at their rightlessness, and assimilated Jews cursed their fate for the unfortunate accident of their Jewish birth. In the Middle Ages, conversion to Christianity always served as an escape valve to deserters seeking exit from exile. Given that Nazi racial anti-Semitism rendered conversion pointless, the current Jews had no escape except through death. Tcherikower and Kalmanovich, both secular Yiddishists, bemoaned the wave of conversions to Christianity in Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland as a symbol of the fact that many modern Jews would engage in the ultimate act of Jewish betrayal, apostasy, despite its likely futility in aiding in their rescue. Had Christianity truly proven capable of protecting them, concluded both Tcherikower and Kalmanovich, the majority of European Jews now would have converted. In focusing on assimilation as the force that had robbed the Jews of their power of spiritual resistance, these men demonstrated that they feared this force no less than anti-Jewish persecution itself. As Tcherikower wrote, quote, "We are governed by a false conviction that assimilation went bankrupt long ago. It is true that theoretically it lost the historical debate that went on for years between it and the nationalist ideology. But if not theoretically, then factually, in our daily lives, assimilation has scored its victory. It is open and above board and goes everywhere, through doors and gates, through the state schools, through general culture, through the language of the country of residence, through education, through economic adaptation, through the street, and through lifestyles which level national individuality and erase the Jewish countenance. It even penetrates deeply into the ranks of our nationalists and Zionists." Unquote. The Oyfen Sheydveg contributors understood assimilation as the key to understanding the historiosophical meaning of the ongoing Nazi persecutions. Like their rabbinic forebears, whom they had consciously rejected, these intellectuals understood persecution as a means to return wayward Jews to the fold. The very inescapability from this persecution, due to its racial basis, made a return of the assimilated to the bosom of their people and its culture all but unavoidable. In Tcherikower's words, "And who knows, perhaps Judaism in the Nazi and semi-fascist countries would have collapsed from within, if not for the providential care of Jewish history, which prompted the contemporary Hamans to think of basing the anti-Semitic movement not on the principle of religion, but of race. And from that standpoint, it is perhaps true that the Holy One, blessed be He, made a blessing for Israel, that this senseless theory rendered conversion to Christianity meaningless." Similarly, Yiddish poet and literary critic Itzik Monger began his essay on Yiddish folklore with the following words, quote, "Modern anti-Semitism, precisely because it arrived in such a brutal form in the classic country of the Jewish Enlightenment movement, has liquidated assimilation as a solution to the Jewish problem, seemingly forever. The unsettled Jewish intelligentsia is searching and groping for the way back, recognizing and discovering the way back to our own nation. That is now the slogan and the marked tendency of the Jewish intellectual." Several paragraphs later, Monger concluded that German and Polish Jewries had to excise the foreign cultures within them and return to their roots. Quote, "I do not deny the beauty of foreign myth. Now, however, in the historical moment when a nation is in need and in the midst of an internal consolidation, we must thoroughly forget the foreign in order to discover what is our own, and thereby ourselves." Unquote. It was Kalmanovich, however, who most fully developed this historiosophy of return. Invoking Achad Ha'am's distinction between the good of Jews and the good of Judaism, Kalmanovich argued that since the advent of emancipation, individual Jews had abandoned the Jewish collective to their personal benefit and to the Jewish nation's detriment. Adopting a Zionist interpretation of the modern Jewish era, Kalmanovich argued that the Jews had become a pathological, suicidal nation. Whereas for most nations, the good of the individual and the good of the collective merged, for the Jews, they tragically diverged. Collapsing 150 years of Jewish history from the French Revolution to the eve of World War II, Kalmanovich asserted that every modern Jewish movement, with the exception of Zionism, further undermined the Jewish collective until the Jewish nation had ceased to exist. Kalmanovich's most explosive conclusion was that the ultimate triumph of democracy would at best save Jewish individuals, but not the Jewish nation. In fact, under democratic conditions, the Jewish nation more quickly tended to disappear, whereas under conditions of persecution, it consolidated. He ended the essay with the following dramatic quote about the hammer of history, which according to A. Pushkin, the Russian poet, both, quote, shatters glass and forges steel, unquote, having the potential to reforge the Jewish nation in the Nazi era. To quote Kalmanovich, "The hammer of history smashed the Jewish nation of the Middle Ages. The connection amongst its parts did not withstand the severe blows. Now it strikes again, targeting individuals. It finds them cut off from their roots. It finds them with no one to rely on but themselves, wandering lost in an empty world. What are they, these fragments of the Jewish nation? Are they glass or are they steel? Will the blow from the heavy hammer shatter them once and for all? or will it forge them together into a new unity?" Unquote. Hillel Zeitlin, the Yiddish and Hebrew writer, poet, and religious thinker, agreed with Tcherikower and Kalmanovich that the meaning of the contemporary catastrophe was to break the Jews of their penchant for assimilation. However, unlike nearly all the other writers, Zeitlin believed that divine providence was forcing Jews back into the fold in order to fulfill their unique, biblically ordained spiritual mission. As an overtly religious thinker, Zeitlin insisted that the Jews suffered more than the rest of humanity since God demanded more of them. In the first part of his poetic essay, Zeitlin compared the suffering of contemporary Jewry to that of the prophet Jonah, whom the sailors threw into the sea to save themselves from a raging storm. Whereas to the uninformed observer, Jonah's suffering appeared arbitrary, harsh, and meaningless. In reality, as a prophet running away from God, he deserved his fate. So too, insisted Zeitlin, did the Nazi persecution have the purpose of returning wayward, assimilating Jews to the fold so that they could fulfill their spiritual mission. Unlike the other contributors to the journal, however, he excoriated the Zionists and other Jewish nationalists for claiming to fight assimilation even as they actually furthered it in their quest for Jewish normalization. Although anti-secular and orthodox, Zeitlin had a far more universalist conception of the Jewish mission than many of his secular colleagues in the journal. To him, the Jewish mission was summed up by Exodus 19:6, quote, "But you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation," unquote, which he understood through the words of the 16th century Rabbi Ovadia Sforno, quote, "In order to understand and to teach the entire human race, to call out God's name and to serve him shoulder to shoulder," unquote. The Nazi onslaught, insisted Zeitlin, could serve as a catalyst to the Jews to finally realize their mission of serving as both a, quote, holy nation, unquote, and as a, quote, kingdom of priests, unquote. On how the Jews could spread their message to a world that hated them, however, Zeitlin remained silent. The only other Oyfen Sheydveg contributor to openly speak about a Jewish mission was Avraham Menace, a former activist of the Jewish Labor Bund, historian, and Yiddishist. Menace agreed with Tcherikower and Kalmanovich that European Jews faced the onslaught of Nazism weakened by decades of assimilation. Like them, he concluded that Zionism and diaspora nationalism, in all their forms, supposedly coming as an antidote to assimilation, had further advanced it in nationalist and socialist garb. But unlike them, he agreed with Zeitlin that the Jews were an exceptional people with a unique mission. Recommitting to its true mission, moreover, would prove the only means of the Jewish nation fortifying itself for the dark days ahead. Totally repudiating his former Bundist ideology, Menace demolished the materialist conception of Jewish history, which understood Jewish survival in the diaspora as a result of the vital economic function that Jews played as middlemen. It was not economics that determined Jewish religion, but the reverse. Repudiating the bases of diaspora nationalism, Menace insisted that historically, Jews did not care about their organs of self-government, which were formed by the secular government as a means to collect taxes. Rather, Menace provocatively concluded that traditional religious Jewish life had functioned more democratically than its secular equivalent. Whereas the Beis Medrash, the study house, had addressed the needs of the Jewish individual directly, its secular substitutes involved him or her only indirectly through the anonymous principle of representation. Consequently, Menace concluded, quote, "We have lost the address of the average Jewish person," unquote. When it came to political solutions, Menace remained a staunch diasporist. During the Nazi era, neither Zionism nor territorialism would prove the solution for anything but a small minority of the Jewish people. Rather, the solution to the contemporary crisis was a recommitment to the Jewish mission while remaining in the diaspora. Like Zeitlin and Menace, the Yiddishist educator Avraham Menace argued that the solution to the contemporary crisis rests with the return of the Jews to their culture. Like them, Menace understood the Jewish quest for normalization as the great impediment to self-redemption. In his words, quote, "Fascism can pass from the scene. Dark clouds can disperse, though who knows when, and we will not be rescued but by ourselves alone. The redemption of Jews is found in Jewishness itself. Emancipation is not the redemption. Neither is auto-emancipation. All we have to do is cease pursuing equal rights. We must heal ourselves of our longing for them, of the aspiration to be, quote, as good as other people, unquote. Redemption will come when we cease to seek it somewhere in the worlds of all the others, and when, as proud individuals of a proud collective, we turn to organizing the completeness and unity of our Jewish world. When free from every impulse to imitate, we become immersed in the flow, in the meaning and essence of the eternity of our nation, and seek to find the expression of Jewish eternity in the forms of the present day of the current generation. If the eternal symbol of Jewishness is Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, its interpretation in the current generation is eternal, universal, organized, and creative Jewishness. Every generation has its interpretation, its meaning of the Jewish one," unquote. Unlike Zeitlin and more like Menace, Menace interpreted the current embodiment of Jewish exceptionalism in secular terms. He removed the one of the central biblical verse, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, from the divine to the national realm. The one now symbolized eternal, universal, organized, and creative Jewishness. Some Oyfen Sheydveg contributors believed in Jewish national normalization rather than exceptionalism. Rather than understanding the Jews as a nation that operated either within sacred text or its secular equivalent, those who pursued normalization mostly believed that Jewish suffering emerged from some flaw in the relationship between Jews and their non-Jewish neighbors. Fix this flaw, the logic went, and the Jewish situation would normalize. Kalmanovich, for instance, believed that Zionism held out the hope for normalization through the reconstitution of the Jewish nation in a state in the land of Israel. Now I turn to the back to the ghetto debate, which Oyfen Sheydveg continued on its pages. Tcherikower disagreed with Apotashu and Leivik's insistence that the Jews never willingly lived in a ghetto. Rather, Tcherikower said, Jews had chosen to live in their own quarters of the city as far back as the 11th century, only turning against this arrangement when the non-Jewish authorities forced it upon them through the erection of ghetto walls. Tcherikower, too, was ready to call his readers into the ghetto from which, he argued, they never really had left. By ghetto, he made it clear, he did not mean that modern Jews would, quote, rebuild the fallen walls of the ghetto and put on a yellow patch, unquote, but rather that they would have a haven from which to escape from the civilization that had betrayed them. When it came to the call of return to religion, Tcherikower sympathized, but believed that such a re-embrace of traditional Judaism by the secular intelligentsia would prove impossible. Over the past 150 years, he wrote, traditional Judaism had lost its sway to two opposing trends: the Reform Judaism of Central and Western Europe, which he judged as lacking, quote, a national soul, unquote, and Jewish socialism and nationalism, which respectively waged war against the Jewish God and failed to create a secular substitute to the binding national glue of the Jewish religion. He understood this neither nor position, in which the Jewish nationalist intelligentsia had despaired of humanism, but could not re-embrace the religious faith and lifestyle of their youths as, quote, the tragedy of a generation, unquote. In his words, we know that the call back to the past is futile. The old sources of religious faith are quite dried up, even among the folk masses themselves. Our generation has fallen too far into skepticism, indifference, and criticism to be able and willing to bind itself once again with tefillin straps. We long ago lost the past simplicity of religious faith, and no one is capable of pouring the old wine back into the old wineskins. But neither do we have the strength to free ourselves completely from the need for yontif, or from jealousy toward the harmonious religious world of previous generations. We are tired of gray, rationalistic commonplaces. A tragedy of a generation that conducts a struggle with itself, an inward struggle between modernism and patrimony, unquote. Gollum, the other Oyfen Sheydveg contributor to call his readers back to the ghetto, offered a much less subtle, unambiguous definition of what he meant by the term. In his words, quote, I am explicitly calling for a return to the ghetto. Ghetto was a terrifying word for the generations of Jews who believed in Europe, in its culture and conscience, who, for a coquettish gesture from Europe, wanted to give away everything in its entirety. Ghetto led to trembling amongst those Jews who, exhausted from their Jewishness, believed that at any moment they would be redeemed from Jewishness, not from Jewish afflictions, but rather from Jewishness itself. In contrast, for us today, ghetto is not a terrifying word, but rather a symbol of our own I, of that which we are. Ghetto is spiritual, moral, and cultural independence. Ghetto is not imitating anyone, not running after anyone, not begging cultural handouts from anyone. Ghetto is self-worth and Jewish pride, respect for ourselves, for the human being in the Jew, for the Jew in the Jew. Ghetto is the symbol of everything that we possess, that we have, that is our own. Fleeing from the ghetto, we lost everything. We lost ourselves. If there exists today some sort of Jewishness, of Jewish nation, of tendency, of will, of path, of effort to create something Jewish, if there exists anything of the sort, it all traces its origins exclusively and solely to the great ghetto, to Eastern European Jewry. Yes, the time is ripe to issue the call, Jews into the ghetto, but wholeheartedly, faithfully, body and soul. In our ghetto, there is plenty to build and plenty with which to build it, unquote. Whereas Tcherikower expressed uneasiness about the new declarations of Jewish chosenness by those who embraced the call of return to the ghetto, Gollum embraced it in his words, quote, and just between us, when I attempt to evaluate our cultural tendencies and theirs, the objective tendencies of Jewish and non-Jewish culture, I do not lose heart at all. I look at our, quote, poverty, unquote, without any sort of feeling of contempt. I see the great and powerful accomplishments of science and civilization that dominate the world, that compete with God, and I am horror-struck because all of this is obviously the legacy of the idol Moloch, of Asmodeus, who seeks only to annihilate the human being, the God in the human being, who needs all of civilization, the sciences, only in order to better, more neatly, and more deftly destroy God's world. The more rational the tricks, the more scientific the progress, the more brutal the evil in people becomes, the more like Sodom the world becomes, and the closer is likewise Sodom's end." Unquote. In conclusion, the journal Oyfen Sheydveg reveals European Jewish intellectuals, especially Yiddishist ones, at, quote, "at the crossroads," unquote, in more ways than one. In hindsight, we know what some of them only could intuit, that as David Roski's put it, quote, "no exit would have been a more accurate name," unquote, for the journal than At the Crossroads. After only one more published issue of the journal had appeared in August, World War II began, spelling the end of East European Jewish civilization, whose fate the journal's authors so vociferously debated. Yet, on another level, the journal reveals the many crossroads at which Yiddish culture stood in that fateful year, 1939, between emancipation and counter-emancipation, historical reality and meta-historical meaning, political and cultural engagement versus retreat, national exceptionalism versus normalization, and ideological change versus continuity. Most tragically, these men found themselves at the crossroads between extreme persecution at the hands of Nazi Germany and what they perceived as radical assimilation at the hands of the Soviet Union. In their refusal to turn to the Soviet Union for refuge, despite the extreme physical peril that Nazi expansionism posed to their lives, these men served as harbingers of the post-war neoconservative turn of Holocaust historian and American Jewish public intellectual Lucy Davidovich and other children of East European immigrants who saw the Soviet left as the greatest threat to Jewish national and religious survival. Particularly in the essays of Tcherikower and Kalmanovich, one sees that some East European Jewish intellectuals had reached this conclusion not following the defeat of Nazism as their American successors, but even at the height of Nazi power. In fact, although he could not have anticipated it, Kalmanovich shocked the post-war readers of his Vilna Ghetto diary, in which he wrote that he preferred the physical destruction of Vilna at the hands of the Nazis to the spiritual ruination of the Jerusalem of Lithuania at the hands of the Soviets. From our distance of 80 years, we can understand that all of Jewish culture stood at a crossroads in 1939. Tcherikower and many other contributors to the journal mourned the no man's land between loss of religious faith and despair in humanism in which they found themselves. Writ larger, however, we can see that these writers proved the last to combine both text and context, and both the Jewish and European humanistic canons. Nearly all of these writers peppered their essays with references to the millennia-old Jewish religious tradition, to modern Hebrew and Yiddish literatures, and to works of 19th and 20th century European humanism. Few or none today possess natural familiarity with all three of these worlds. The Oyfen Sheydveg contributors sensed that the twin processes of extreme persecution and assimilation were rendering their uneasy combination of these cultural ingredients of identity and anachronism. They sensed that these processes would destroy East European Jewish civilization, which embodied the synthesis that they lived. In fact, they were honest enough to admit to their audiences that internal processes already had eroded their cultural identity and thwarted its transmission. Standing on the precipice of disaster, none of these writers could know just how prescient their sense of loss was. With 80 years of hindsight, we can say that Oyfen Sheydveg serves as a document that demonstrates the vast gulf between Jewish culture of then and now. The contemporary reader thus can approach the essays of Oyfen Sheydveg with the famous words of L.P. Hartley, quote, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there."